Tonight, a royal tomb can wait because Penub has been sent to carry stones for a scribe, and another scribe must record the resulting absence. Royal Eternity, it appears, has encountered scheduling. If careful history honestly suits your evening, you may like or subscribe and tell me where you are listening and the local time there. Let the room grow dim and settle in the position that asks the least of you. You are in western Thebes in year 40 of Ramesses II, at the walled village now called Deir el-Medina. An adult crew scribe has a broad limestone flake on his knees, black ink on one side, red on the other, and a row of names waiting for the day to become legible. The village is small enough for the scribe to know most of those names before he writes them. It is also unusual enough that we should not mistake it for every Egyptian workplace. These are specialized craftspeople attached to the royal tombs of the New Kingdom, living with their families between the cultivated Nile Valley and the desert cliffs. Administrators and draftsmen here were literate, and other residents sometimes wrote too. But not every worker held a brush or read a register. The title's phrase, "almost everything," is playful. The record is abundant, intimate and uneven, not complete. The scribe does not know that distinction will matter 3,000 years later. He only knows that the first man expected at the path has not appeared, and a blank space has begun to acquire authority. You are not looking at Egypt in general. You are looking at one walled village of specialists west of the Theban fields, which is exactly why its paperwork is so unusually detailed. He draws the brush through black ink and checks the arrangement already planned across the stone. The surviving attendant's ostracon from this reign is unusually large, with names fitted into deliberate spaces on both faces. Dates gather below each worker, while reasons can be added in red above them. The modern scholar has suggested that daily notes may first have been made on smaller chips and later copied into this larger compilation. That is an inference, not a message left by the anonymous writer explaining his office routine. Still, the idea fits the object in your hands. The surface is not a fresh papyrus sheet with generous margins. It is a limestone offcut whose shape was decided by a mason, a fracture, and perhaps a mild dislike of straight edges. The stone itself is large, roughly 38 by 33 centimeters, with names in black soot ink and reasons added in red ochre above them. Footsteps approach from the village gate. Penub is back, dusty at the shins, and his absence is not mysterious. The record associates him on one date with carrying stones for a scribe. We cannot recover the conversation that produced the note, so this handoff is carefully staged rather than quoted. The crew scribe asks enough to place the duty and day. Penub answers, and the red brush supplies the reason above the black dates. The small comedy is administrative rather than personal. A scribe's private stone carrying has created more work for a scribe. Once the line is placed, Penub's problem becomes part of the crew's problem. A missing worker changes who can cut, smooth, plaster, draw, or paint, and the list exists, so those changes remain intelligible after the voices have moved on. You will hear this reason again because somebody wrote it down. Carrying stones for a scribe is the kind of small reassignment that would vanish anywhere else. The crew does not arrive as one anonymous mass. New Kingdom tomb workers were organized in a body called the Crew of the Tomb, with foremen, scribes, draftsmen, carpenters, stoneworkers, plasterers, painters, and supporting labor. In some periods, the working body was divided into right and left sides, each responsible for its side of the tomb. The exact size changed across reigns and years, which is one reason a single list cannot stand for every decade. Your scribe knows today's names, not an ideal chart in a modern book. He marks one man present, another away, and a third assigned elsewhere. The register is less a portrait of bureaucracy than a tool for preventing tomorrow's explanation from becoming a contest between memory, status, and whoever can speak longest without taking a breath. The body was called the Crew of the Tomb, and it included draftsmen, carpenters, and suppliers, as well as the men who cut stone. A worker with sore eyes stands near the doorway, rather than on the path to the valley. Eye trouble appears in the surviving absence record, though its cause and severity are not supplied. The scribe can write the condition without turning it into a diagnosis. That restraint matters. Many ancient notes preserve a reason in a few words, while modern readers are tempted to build a full medical history from the space of a thumb. Here the man simply cannot perform close, dusty work well today. His place on the crew must be covered, and the brush moves. Red ink gives the reason visual weight, black ink preserves the dates. The colors help structure the document, but the sick worker is not thinking about document design. He is blinking against light and waiting to be released from an official conversation. You are given the condition and nothing else. If you want a cause or a severity, the stone declines to supply one. Another name receives the plain word ill. It is the most common kind of reason in this register, and it is also one of the least revealing. Ill might cover fever, pain, weakness, an injury, or something else entirely. Clusters of absences may suggest illness moving through the community, but the ostracon does not certify an epidemic. The scribe records what his task requires, and no more. This is one reason the village seems to have recorded almost everything, while still withholding so much. A line tells us that work stopped for one person on one day. It does not tell us how the household rearranged food, water, care, and sleep around him. You watch the brush finish the short word. The official record is precise at its edge and silent beyond it. Illness is the commonest entry and the least informative. A modern study of this village's health has to work outward from exactly that vagueness. A healer's name brings a different pattern. Paria Pejet appears with many absences connected to visiting people and preparing remedies. One entry places him with a man named Cons, making medicines. The list therefore catches care as work that draws a crew member away from royal work. It does not tell us that every remedy succeeded, nor does it let us divide ancient healing into tidy modern departments. For the scribe, the consequence is practical. Paharia Pejet will not take his regular place today, because another body in the village needs him elsewhere. The crew loses one pair of hands, and the household gains them. A royal tomb is meant to last through eternity, but eternity must wait while someone measures, mixes, and carries what a sick neighbor requires. You can see care counted as work here. A man preparing medicines is absent from the tomb, so his absence enters the same list as a scorpion sting. The scribe pauses to sharpen the reed brush against the rim of his palette. His tools are modest: a brush, water, cakes of pigment, and whatever suitable surface the day has offered. Limestone chips were plentiful around tomb cutting, and pottery sherds could also hold notes, accounts, letters, sketches, exercises, and literary passages. Papyrus existed and was used, but it was more valuable than a convenient stone flake. This material choice helped create the record density that now makes el-Medina feel so near. The village generated paperwork because its work demanded allocation, supplies, correspondence, and accountability. It also had skilled writers living beside abundant scrap. The desert preserved much of what was discarded. An entire historical intimacy rests partly on the good fortune that broken stone is difficult to crumple into nothing. Everything you would need to keep this record fits in one hand. Limestone chips were free, plentiful, and lying everywhere around the tomb cutting. A young carrier arrives with a smaller chip from the worksite. It bears a quick note of names and days, the sort of temporary record that could later be consolidated. We cannot prove that this exact transfer happened for the famous year 40 register, so the scene stays modest. The scribe compares the marks, asks one clarifying question, and copies only what fits. A cramped line forces him to tighten his signs. The stone has no concern for legibility and has reserved its broadest patch for nobody. He turns it a little, finds a smoother angle, and continues. Every change of surface alters the movement of the brush. The resulting document is administrative, but the hand remains visible in its spacing, corrections, and choices about what can be squeezed beside what. You are watching a draft become a record. The small chip carries names and days. The large stone will carry the version that has been checked. The next absence concerns a burial or a village religious observance, reasons that occur repeatedly in the record. No joke belongs here. Death, ritual, and communal obligation could properly interrupt work, and the scribe's note marks that interruption without explaining the grief within it. He asks the date, then places it with the name. Dear el-Medina's records often bring formal and household worlds onto the same surface. A crew built royal burial places, while its members also buried relatives, joined festivals, sought divine guidance, wrote prayers, and cared for their own tombs. The royal project did not erase local life. It depended on people who remained sons, parents, spouses, neighbours, and worshippers after they left the valley path. The attendant stone preserves that collision in a few economical strokes. You are not told what the death meant to anyone. The note marks that work stopped and leaves the rest where it belongs. At the edge of the gathering, Seba has no need to invent an explanation. The surviving register notes that a worker of that name was badly stung, understood by scholars as a scorpion sting. The entry does not preserve the hour, treatment, or outcome. It gives only enough to keep the absence accountable. In the staged mourning, another adult speaks for him while he remains at home. The scribe adds the reason and does not ask the stone to carry more than it can. The modern listener may be drawn to the specificity, but the deeper point is ordinary. Dangerous creatures, eye trouble, illness, family care, ritual duties, and assigned labor all changed the crew's day. Administration became intimate because the state required bodies at work, and bodies repeatedly had other obligations. You know the sting happened because someone wrote it in red. You do not know the hour, the treatment, or whether Seba was well the following week. Two names at the end of a face appear with unusually long spaces. The arrangement of the real ostracon suggests the writer anticipated lengthy entries and placed such names where room remained. That small act of planning is easy to miss. Before the first absence could be copied, someone had to imagine how much trouble each line might cause. The scribe has, in effect, budgeted inconvenience. One man accumulates many dates, another receives only one. On the surviving object, 40 workers are named, and only 2 appear without absentee entries. That does not mean those 2 never faltered in all of life, only that this compilation recorded no absence for them across the period it covers. A clean line can be as misleading as a crowded one when treated as a biography. If you read those clean lines as proof of 2 exceptionally diligent men, you would be overreading a gap. 40 workers are named, and only 2 carry no absence dates at all. The register is labelled with year 40 of Ramesses II and covers a long span of working days. Dates are organised by the Egyptian calendar rather than by the weekdays familiar now. You need not memorise the system to feel the scribe's burden. A name must connect to the correct season, month and day, and a reason must sit where another reader can find it. One misplaced mark could turn a household duty into an unexplained absence, or attach one man's illness to another. The scribe rereads the last group softly, not as ceremony but as checking. Penub waits long enough to learn that carrying stones for a writer does not exempt him from waiting for writing. The brush finally lifts, and one small uncertainty has been pinned to its proper date. You are looking at roughly 280 days of tracking. That is not a snapshot, but a season of somebody keeping count. Beyond the gate, the path toward the royal valleys climbs through pale ground. Some workers would spend stretches near the worksite, rather than walk back each night, using huts closer to the tombs. The village and the work area were connected by routine movements of people, tools, food, messages, and records. Attendance was therefore not a simple doorway count. A man might be absent from one task because he was serving another, staying at the work camp, ill at home, or engaged in a recognized duty. The scribe's list coordinates that distributed community. He cannot see every activity from his seat. He depends on foremen, carriers, workers, and previous notes. The record looks authoritative when finished, because all records do. Its making is a chain of reports, corrections, and trust. You could walk that path in the time it takes the ink to dry. The record's authority is assembled from reports, corrections, and trust, rather than from certainty. A foreman comes to review the left and right sides. The crew division is practical, tied to work on corresponding sides of a tomb, but it also shapes administration and identity. Names can be grouped, assignments compared, and missing hands noticed. The foreman points to a worker borrowed for a different duty. The scribe adjusts the note, rather than erasing the person from the day. That distinction matters. Absence from the usual place is not always absence from labor. A worker can be carrying stone, preparing remedies, caring for family, or performing another assigned task. The register turns varied obligations into a form the administration can use. Its neatness is achieved only after the day has refused to be neat, which may be the most durable principle in the history of office work. You are looking at a hierarchy with sides. In relevant periods, the crew was split into right and left, each responsible for its own portion of the tomb. Near midday, talk shifts from names to supplies. The crew could not work on prestige alone. Grain rations functioned as a central form of payment, and other provisions, tools, water, fuel, cloth, oil, or fish appear in records from the community at different times. The exact quantities and schedules varied, and the surviving documents are not uniform. Today, one worker says his household allocation does not match what he expected. The attendant scribe cannot solve the delivery by changing a mark, but he can separate the issue from absence and send it toward the proper account. A complaint about grain belongs to the same documentary world as a list of workers because labor, payment, and presence are connected. The tomb wall may show gods. The supporting ostracon shows who still needs dinner. You cannot separate the wall from the dinner. The same literate specialists who recorded gods on plaster recorded who was still owed grain. A ration ostracon now in the British Museum records distributions to the dear el-Medina workforce on both sides of a limestone flake. Such documents are terse, but they expose the routine beneath royal construction. Grain had to be harvested, transported, measured, allocated, and acknowledged before it became bread and beer in village households. The scribe before you does not perform that entire chain. He makes one link legible. He copies a name onto a separate chip, adds the issue, and sends the carrier toward an administrator. The bundle of records begins to multiply around his knees. Limestone is cheap enough to encourage paperwork and heavy enough to punish enthusiasm. By noon, the scribe has achieved the ancient equivalent of a crowded desk, except his desk can bruise a foot. A separate ostracon in the same collection records ration distribution across both faces. Attendance and payment were kept as parallel records you could check against each other. A question rises from the title itself. Why do these workers seem to have recorded almost everything? Not because the entire population of Egypt lived this way, and not because every villager wrote down every thought. Dear el-Medina combined an exceptional state project, a concentrated skilled community, administrative oversight, local legal and economic activity, literate specialists, abundant writing surfaces, and dry preservation. The royal tomb crew needed assignments, attendance, rations, tools, and progress tracked. Households also exchanged goods, sent letters, copied texts, practiced writing, sought judgments, and drew images. Many records survived because stone and pottery endure, and because desert deposits protected them. The density is the product of institutions, habits, material, and preservation, not a national diary. The worker watches the new chip leave with the person responsible for checking it. You should resist reading this as a national diary. What you have is one community's habits, cheap writing material, and a dry climate that kept the results. The scribe turns the ostracon to its reverse. The back is already busy, and a thin area near the edge threatens to flake. The object that survives in a museum is not indestructible. Limestone can split, ink can fade, and a find can lose its archaeological context. Many Deir el-Medina texts were dispersed among collections, and the history of excavation and collecting was uneven. What remains is therefore a selection shaped by ancient disposal and modern recovery. The scribe knows none of this. He sees a surface that must last until the compilation is useful. He avoids the weakest patch and writes around it. The gap left by damaged stone becomes a reminder that even unusually rich evidence arrives with missing corners, unread signs, unknown authors, and questions the original clerk never meant to answer. You receive this evidence damaged. Missing corners, unread signs, and unknown authors come with it, and none of that was the original clerk's problem. You are reading over the shoulder of somebody who expected to be the only reader. A worker named Neferabu appears in the historical register, with an absence linked to his daughter's purification, a term scholars understand in relation to menstruation. Similar notes concern wives or daughters. The entries should not be turned into jokes or proof of one universal custom. The record does not tell us exactly what household circumstances justified each absence, and modern explanations remain interpretive. In the scene, the scribe accepts the recognized reason and writes it without comment. The practical consequence is enough. A family duty keeps the worker home. The line reveals that administrative attention reached into household rhythms, but not that the administration understood or controlled every detail. A few red words preserve an obligation while protecting most of the day from us. The absence is accepted without turning private care into public entertainment. You get the obligation without the household behind it. The record protects most of that day from you, which is a courtesy it never intended. The next man has returned after a village festival. Religious observances could be recorded among legitimate reasons away, joining illness, burials, care, and assigned tasks. The scribe checks whether the absence spans one day or more. His concern is placement, not theology. He knows the festival by participation, but the register needs only a category and date. This compression is one reason administrative texts can feel both intimate and distant. They mention a festival without music, a burial without tears, a sickness without pain, and a family duty without conversation. Their power lies in the contact point between official need and human life. Their limit lies in everything compressed away. The scribe adds one more red notation, then blows gently across the ink while the worker tries not to look impatient. You would call this a public holiday. The scribe calls it a reason, writes it in red, and moves to the next name. A draftsman stops beside the palette with a different sort of chip. On it, a figure has been sketched in fluid black lines, perhaps as practice, planning, or visual play. Figured ostraca from the community range from working drawings to images whose purpose remains uncertain. The village record is not only words, it includes sketches, plans, measurements, and artistic exercises produced by people whose professional work required controlled lines on plastered walls. The scribe glances, recognizes the hand, and returns the chip. There is no reason to force every drawing into a single category. Some may be drafts, some training, some finished pieces, some something else. The lesson is not that every scrap has been decoded. It is that a community of makers left many kinds of marks because making marks was part of its work. You are surrounded by more kinds of writing than you might expect. Letters, accounts, court records, exercises, sketches, and literature all sat on chips like these. The range is the point. A community that wrote constantly left behind the shape of its ordinary week. A boy passes the doorway carrying a writing exercise, but the story stays with the adult scribe. Deir el-Medina has yielded literary passages, model letters, lists of words, and exercises that scholars connect, with varying confidence, to teaching. Yet not every literary ostrakon was necessarily a student's mistake sheet. Skilled hands copied literature too, and context is often incomplete. The adult checks a sign on the exercise, gives it back, and resumes the register. Learning happens beside administration rather than in a separate schoolroom we can reconstruct with certainty. The village's high concentration of literate activity did not make literacy universal. It made writing visible, useful, and transferable within some households and occupations. The brush could serve a ration account in the morning and a copied story later, without making those texts the same kind of evidence. You should not treat a copied story and a ration account as the same kind of evidence, even when the same brush wrote both. The scribe now counts the names already resolved. Presence is the simplest category, and therefore leaves the least interesting trace. A man who arrived, worked, and caused no administrative trouble may receive only the structure of the list. The absent worker produces detail. This creates a bias familiar in records everywhere. Disruption becomes visible, routine becomes background. We learn why Seba stayed away because the sting broke the schedule. We may learn almost nothing about a healthy worker who completed hundreds of ordinary strokes on a tomb wall. The register therefore magnifies exceptions. Its celebrated excuses are not a comic catalogue of unreliable employees. They are the points where life crossed the requirements of the crew strongly enough to require notation. The scribe is not collecting anecdotes. He is repairing the day's account. You may want a narrative here. What you are being handed is a corrected account, which is a different and considerably more reliable thing. A carrier returns from the valley with confirmation that one reassigned worker has reached the worksite. The scribe adds the date and closes the open space. This small consequence shows what the register actually does. It allows the crew to distinguish a missing person from a moved person, a ration dispute from illness, and an accepted household duty from an unexplained gap. Later administrators can compare days and allocations. Foremen can see whether the available crew matches the planned work. The list does not build the tomb, but it keeps labor from dissolving into rumor. The worker whose location was uncertain is now accounted for. A red note and a black date are less dramatic than a painted burial chamber, though the chamber depends on many such quiet acts of coordination. You would not think to record this moment. The painted chamber that everyone does record depends on exactly this kind of unremarkable coordination. The afternoon wind sends grit across the threshold. The scribe covers the damp ink with his hand, choosing the clean side of administration over the accurate side of weather. Dust settles anyway. Dear el-Medina stood in an arid landscape, and that dryness later favored preservation. But it was not a museum climate for the people living there. Water had to be carried, shade mattered, and writing surfaces collected dirt before they collected catalogue numbers. He wipes the unused corner and checks the weakest edge. The same environment that protects records over centuries can trouble their making over minutes. He waits for the gust to pass, then continues. One grain of sand clings beside a sign, contributing nothing to history and refusing to leave. The corrected entry now gives the complaint a place to stand. You are watching the least glamorous conditions imaginable produce the best documented workforce in the ancient world. A second scribe arrives to compare a ration note with the attendance compilation. Administrative roles could overlap in a small, specialized community, though specific responsibilities varied by time and office. They read the names together and identify a mismatch. A man marked present has not been included in the expected distribution. The error might belong to a copy, a delivery, or an assumption. The surviving documents rarely let us watch every correction, so this resolution is plausible staging. They do what records invite people to do: set one list beside another until the disagreement becomes visible. The worker is called over, the day confirmed, and a fresh chip prepared. Writing does not eliminate error. It gives error a surface on which to be found, argued over, and sometimes repaired. You are seeing why two records exist. One list can be wrong quietly, two lists disagree out loud, and disagreement is what eventually gets repaired. That repair broadens the answer to the episode's promise. Attendance, rations, work allocation, tools, transactions, court cases, letters, prices, sketches, literary texts, teaching, religion, and household matters all appear in the el-Medina corpus. They do not appear evenly, and no single archive contains the village whole. Some genres survive in hundreds of fragments, others in a few. Some writers are known by hand or name, many are not. Some texts can be dated closely, others only approximately. The scribe before you contributes one administrative object to that broken abundance. He is not trying to reveal daily life to the future. He is trying to make a crew and its provisions understandable to colleagues who already know the village. The intimacy is an unintended gift. Nobody wrote this for you. The intimacy you are hearing is a byproduct of a clerk trying to be understood by colleagues who already knew everyone involved. Pennob returns once more, this time to ask whether his assignment has been entered against the correct date. The scribe points with the dry end of the brush. The line is there. The worker reads enough of the situation, if not necessarily every sign, and nods. We should resist turning this moment into proof of his literacy. Dear el-Medina included more literate people than many communities, and evidence suggests writing knowledge beyond official scribes, but abilities differed. Recognition of a name, mark, date, or administrative outcome is not the same as fluent reading and composition. The scene remains practical. Pennob wants to know that tomorrow's ration or foreman's question will not be damaged by today's extra task. The scribe wants the same thing, partly because corrections have already occupied enough stone. You can hear the ordinary anxiety in the question. He wants tomorrow's ration to be right, which is the only reason any of this matters to him. The register has now absorbed the day's interruptions. A sick worker remains home. Peheria Paget prepares remedies. A family duty is acknowledged. A burial and festival are placed. One man is reassigned, one ration discrepancy forwarded, and Pennob's stone carrying attached to its date. Nothing about this is literally everything. The stone does not preserve the tone of the reports, the scribe's private worries, the worker's exact pain, or the full reasoning behind every accepted absence. Yet it records enough categories of ordinary life to make the village exceptional in the historical record. The title earns its answer through accumulation. Administration met a concentrated literate community, cheap durable scraps, and favourable preservation, producing a documentary closeness rare for the ancient world. The final mark is small, but its administrative consequence is not. What reaches you across 3,000 years is not a monument but a working list, kept because somebody needed it to be accurate by evening. The corpus runs to thousands of pieces, cheap limestone, concentrated literate specialists, and a dry climate together produced a closeness rare anywhere in the ancient world. The scribe rereads the face from top to bottom. Names hold still now, which people seldom do. He catches one crowded date and strengthens a faded sign. Red entries guide the eye through reasons. Black entries carry the main structure. The distinction is useful without being perfectly consistent across every ancient document. Here it lets him find what he needs before the light moves. The final check is not ceremonial. A copied error could follow a worker into another account, and the village's documentary abundance did not protect individuals from administrative inconvenience. The broad ostracon is heavy in his hands. Its weight suggests seriousness, though that may simply be limestone taking credit for what ink has done. The closed list can guide tomorrow without pretending to own the whole day. You are looking at limestone that has outlasted the tomb's schedule, the crew, and the rain. It survives because it was cheap, and nobody thought to destroy it. He passes the corrected ration chip to a carrier, who starts toward the office responsible for the distribution. The attendance problem has a consequence and a route toward resolution. Pennob joins the workers heading to their assigned places. The man with sore eyes turns home. The scribe stacks the smaller notes beside the larger compilation and covers the pallet. Story 1 has answered how these Egyptian workers came to record so much. Not through universal literacy or a complete diary, but through specialized royal labor, administrative need, local writing practices, abundant ostraca and papyrus, and extraordinary survival. The answer is less fantastic than the title, and more interesting than a miracle. It is a work system built from people who kept having ordinary days. The stored surface keeps its silence while the people it names keep moving. You will not learn the carrier's name. The system depended on people, the system did not trouble itself to record. Before the village breaks for the next movement, the scribe stores the broad stone where its ink will not be rubbed. The register is incomplete because every record is incomplete, yet it is complete enough for today's crew. Outside, tools are already moving toward the Royal Valley. A basket of grain awaits checking. A plasterer's mallet needs repair. The attendant's stone stays behind while the labour it describes goes on without it. That quiet separation forms the bridge. The written day rests on a shelf. The workers cross the pale ground carrying the next set of problems that will require stone, plaster, pigment, food, water, and more notes than anyone has yet made. The writing kit follows because the next correction will begin where the labour changes. You are leaving the office and following the work. The writing kit travels because corrections happen wherever the labour happens. The path bends out of sight of the village wall. Penub adjusts the strap on a tool bundle and falls into step with the others. No one is discussing posterity. They are discussing who has the sound chisel, whether the grain account will be corrected, and how much plaster can be prepared before the heat deepens. The scribe walks last with a smaller writing kit, because work records must follow work closely enough to remain useful. Behind them, the attendant's ostracon holds red reasons and black dates. Ahead lies the royal tomb, where the crew will turn rock into prepared surfaces, and prepared surfaces into images. The day has been counted. Now it must be made. The morning's register has become a route plan under his feet. You are walking the same ground the register described. A list of who is present becomes, out here, a question of who is actually carrying something. At the work site, the crew's first task is not painting. Stone has to be cut, spoil removed, walls brought to line, cracks managed, and surfaces prepared in stages. The exact sequence varied with the tomb and with what earlier teams had left behind. Penub joins men moving baskets away from a newly worked section. The limestone is softer than granite, but not obedient. Chisels dull, wooden handles loosen, and debris occupies every convenient foothold. A foreman checks who is assigned to each side. The scribe notes the distribution on a smaller flake. Here the attendant's register becomes action. One missing stoneworker changes the pace of cutting, and one reassigned carrier changes how quickly rubble leaves. Organization is visible not in a chart, but in the basket waiting for hands. Each returned tool keeps the next assignment possible. You would expect a tomb crew to begin by painting. They begin by moving spoil, fetching water, and finding out which tools survived yesterday. You cannot move a crew through a blocked corridor, so spoil removal comes before everything else. A stoneworker tests the edge of a copper alloy chisel and finds it blunter than he would like. Metal tools required maintenance, repair, and replacement, and records from the tomb community track tools, because state property and scarce materials could not simply vanish into the dust. The worker passes the chisel to a colleague responsible for sharpening while taking another from the bundle. The exchange is noted. Royal imagery begins with a tool whose edge must be accounted for before it can produce a straight line. Penub lifts the next basket, careful not to knock the scribe's pallet. The pallet has selected the narrowest safe ledge and appears confident that everyone else should adapt. They do, because wet ink has a talent for making its own importance known. The sharpened edge returns to the bundle before the next cut begins. You can see the sequence that painting depends on. Cutting, clearing, plaster, water, and tool repair all happen before any pigment is opened. Farther inside, a plasterer runs his hand across a prepared patch. Cut rock rarely offers the smooth, continuous plane a painter needs. Irregularities can be filled and surfaces coated, creating a ground for drawing and color. The plasterer's ordinary goal is to finish one wall section without wasting material or trapping loose grit beneath it. He mixes what the crew has received, checks the consistency, and presses it into a shallow defect. Too dry, and it will not bind well. Too wet, and it will delay those waiting behind him. The scribe records progress in practical terms. There is no tomb tour here, only a sequence of dependencies. The draftsman cannot set out figures until the plasterer finishes, and the plasterer cannot finish if the water carrier is late. The wall accepts the patch, and the next craft can approach. You are watching a queue of trades. The plasterer waits on the water carrier, and the painter waits on the plasterer. Water arrives in skin containers and jars, carried across a landscape where none flows beside the village. The tomb workers depended on supporting labor for water, food, fuel, and materials. Those carriers belong to the work system, even when grand accounts center the decorated chambers. One container is set beside the plaster crew, another reserved for drinking, and a third has leaked enough to darken the dust along its seam. The carrier tightens the binding and receives a look from the plasterer. No speech is needed. Every craft on the royal project has strong opinions about water, especially when another craft has spilled it. The foreman reallocates what remains, and the scribe adjusts the delivery note rather than pretending the jar arrived full. The plasterer saves the cleanest water for the final smoothing. You should notice that water is imported here. The village sat where nothing flowed, so every jar on this wall arrived on somebody's shoulder. Water had to be carried in skins and jars across ground where none was available. The delivery note is adjusted rather than rounded up. Once the wall is ready, a draftsman approaches with cord, straight edge, palette, and practiced eye. Surviving tomb decoration shows that figures and texts could be laid out through guiding lines and corrected as work advanced. Dear el-Medina's draftsmen were specialists, not casual doodlers promoted by a lucky afternoon. He marks a baseline, measures the available field, and begins the first controlled strokes. A correction in red can guide a later adjustment, while black lines establish much of the initial drawing, though practice is varied. The adult painter behind him waits without crowding the brush. Waiting is part of cooperation. A surface can move through cutting, smoothing, plaster, drawing, correction, carving, and paint, and each stage must leave the next person something usable. The first line waits for correction before anyone cuts it deeper. You are seeing the first draft of something meant to be permanent. The line is laid down expecting correction, not expecting to be final. The draftsman notices that one figure's hand falls too close to a damaged patch. He changes the line before carving fixes the mistake more stubbornly. This is the advantage of a preparatory drawing, and the danger of an impatient crew member leaning where he should not. Penab steadies a lamp niche and keeps his elbow close. The correction is quiet, specific, and visible. Figured ostraca and surviving wall work show artists testing forms, but not every sketch can be assigned a precise purpose. Here the wall itself gives the consequence. A line moved now saves labor later. The scribe notes no artistic theory. He records that the prepared section is ready for the next stage, which is how a sophisticated visual program becomes, in administration, a sequence of completed tasks. The altered hand now sits comfortably inside the prepared field. You would call this a compromise. The wall's damage decides where a god's hand can go, and the design accommodates the plaster. At midday, baskets arrive from the village with bread and other provisions. The royal crew's compensation centered on grain rations, converted within households into staple foods, while additional goods could supplement the system. Calling this a modern salary would flatten important differences, but calling it a gift would be worse. The state owed provisions for labor. A clerk checks names and amounts against a ration text. The worker with the earlier discrepancy watches his measure closely. Grain is poured, leveled, and recorded. The container is ordinary, yet the whole workday leans toward it. Tomb decoration promises continuity beyond death. The ration measure concerns continuity through supper, which is nearer and therefore receives more immediate attention. The checked measure leaves no room for a casual guess. You can measure the whole system by lunch. Grain was the wage, it was counted, and it could arrive late. Grain moved from harvest toward village households through a scheduled state system. When the schedule slipped, you would have felt it at home before it reached any archive. The disputed allocation does not match the worker's expectation. He points to the attendance note proving he was present, then to the measure already poured. The clerk checks a second list. Perhaps a copy omitted him. Perhaps the delivery is short. Or perhaps the categories have been read differently. The evidence does not preserve this invented individual dispute, so the staging stays within documented procedures and possible errors. What matters is the human-scale consequence. The worker will not accept an unexplained reduction in grain owed to his household. The scribe who carried the corrective chip now places it beside the ration account. Two records meet, and the missing name becomes harder to dismiss. Writing has not solved the shortage, but it has given the complaint a durable spine. The worker keeps his voice level and his evidence close. You are watching writing do its real job. It cannot conjure missing grain, but it can make a complaint precise enough to answer. Work resumes while the officials compare measures. Penub carries plaster tools deeper into the passage and returns with worn baskets. The route is short enough to sound easy until it is repeated in heat, dust, and restricted space. Transport inside a tomb is labor. Spoil moves out, tools and provisions move in, and people must pass without ruining prepared surfaces. A basket catches on a projecting edge. Penub lowers it, turns sideways, and proceeds with the patience of someone who knows the route better than the person who packed it. The bundle was tied as though corridors were a rumor. He reaches the work area without scraping the wall, sets it down, and reports that the handle will not survive many more trips. The corridor rewards narrow loads and patient shoulders. You would want the dispute settled before working again. Nobody here has that option, so the wall advances while the numbers are still being checked. A carpenter examines the basket frame and the handles of several tools. Wood was valuable in Egypt, and wooden equipment needed repair rather than casual disposal. He replaces a weakened binding, wedges a handle, and checks a straight edge for warping. His contribution rarely dominates images of tomb making, but a loose handle can stop a stoneworker as effectively as an absent worker. The scribe lists the repair and the material used. This is another answer to why the village produced so many records. A state workshop must know not only who came, but what they received, returned, damaged, completed, and still required. The carpenter hands the basket back. Its improvement is modest, which is often how useful repairs announce themselves. The repaired binding holds when the basket is lifted again. You will not find this repair mentioned anywhere except as a delay. It is nonetheless the reason tomorrow's baskets arrive intact. On the right side, a painter grinds or mixes pigment in a small container, while another prepares a brush. Mineral and plant materials produced a range of colors, combined with binders, and applied to dry prepared surfaces. The exact recipes and sequence could vary, and modern analysis should not be pasted into the worker's mouth. He knows the mixture by training and use. A speck of dust lands where the color should remain clean. He lifts it with the brush tip and gives the doorway a long look. Dust has followed the crew from quarrying to painting, and now behaves as though it has seniority. The door cannot apologize, so Penub hangs a cloth to reduce the next gust. The painter turns the bowl until the mixture is even. You are close enough to see the mixture change. A gust through the doorway would ruin it, which is why Penub is hanging cloth. Painters and draftsmen sat inside a longer sequence of specialists and supervision, rather than working as free artists. The left and right teams advance at slightly different rates. One section has soundstone and accepts plaster readily. Another reveals a crack that requires extra filling and delay. The foremen confer, then lend a worker across the division for part of the day. The scribe records the temporary change. Crew structures organized work, but real surfaces resisted symmetry. A plan could divide the tomb neatly while geology declined to cooperate. The borrowed worker carries his tools across and joins the slower side. No rivalry needs to be invented. The consequence is enough. One section gains hands, another pauses a less urgent task, and the record prevents tomorrow's allocation from being mistaken for today's. The borrowed worker carries the slower section forward. You cannot assume both sides moved together. One could run ahead, and the record exists partly to keep tomorrow's allocation honest about that. Near the entrance, a delivery of lamp fuel is checked. Work in interior passages required artificial light, and lamps needed wicks and fuel, all of which had to be supplied and monitored. The crew scribe compares the containers with a note. One seal or quantity raises a doubt. Rather than proclaim theft or corruption, he asks the carrier to wait while the measure is verified. Administrative records can tempt modern readers toward dramatic explanations, but shortages also arise from breakage, delay, measurement, and copying. The carrier rests the load carefully. A lamp is a small object with a large consequence. Without steady light, close drawing, carving, and painting stop, regardless of how many workers have answered attendance. The carrier waits beside the containers until the count is settled. You would think light was the least of it. Without fuel, the painting stops, no matter how many workers answered attendance that morning. The ration clerk returns with a partial answer. The worker's name was present on the attendance list, but placed incorrectly on a distribution copy. The current delivery can cover the proper amount if another measure is adjusted and the total checked. This resolution is plausible rather than tied to one surviving case, and it shows why parallel records mattered. The worker watches grain poured again, then sees his name added where it belongs. His household problem is not abstract. The measure will become food. The clerk makes the correction in front of him, and the scribe carries the updated note back to the work area. A simple omission has consumed 3 people, 2 ostraca, 1 argument, and enough time to prove that writing is efficient mainly after it has been written correctly. The corrected line now agrees with the grain in front of them. You are given a partial answer, which is what most of these records actually contain. The line now agrees with the grain, and that is the day's success. Discrepancies between a ration note and the attendance list could be found precisely because both existed. You are watching redundancy earn its keep. Inside, the repaired lamp is lit and placed to illuminate the wall without smoking it more than necessary. The painter tests the light across the corrected drawing. Shadows deepen in incised lines, making some details easier to follow, and others deceptive. He shifts the lamp a hand's breadth. The action is small, but it changes the surface he sees. The crew's work depends on such judgments, learned through repeated practice rather than preserved in one universal manual. The scribe notes that the section has moved from preparation to painting. His record compresses hours of skilled coordination into a phrase. The workers do not resent the compression. They need the list to be useful, not poetic, and the wall itself carries the fuller evidence of their hands. The wall receives color only after the light is placed well. Light had to be placed before color could be applied. A badly set lamp smokes the surface it was brought to reveal. A foreman checks the day's progress against what remains. Attendance, tools, supplies, and surface condition have all altered the plan. He decides that one crew will stop before beginning a fresh panel, while another completes the plaster already mixed. Starting a new stage too late would leave material or work exposed. Penub carries the decision down the passage. The message travels mouth to mouth, then reaches the scribe as a completed adjustment. Not every instruction required a written document. Oral coordination and written records worked together. The abundance of ostraca should not make the village sound silent except for brushes. People spoke, remembered, negotiated, and argued. Writing stabilized selected parts of that activity. The unfinished panel remains protected for the following day. The day's final allocation now matches what each side can safely finish. Progress is measured against what remains rather than what was hoped for. The unfinished panel is protected rather than rushed. Each side could safely finish only so much before light and setting plaster decided the limit. At the outer work area, empty grain containers and damaged tools are gathered for return. Accounts often move in both directions. An item issued may need to be acknowledged, repaired, or replaced. A tool not returned can become a question, and a short measure can become a grievance. Penub checks the strap on the bundle before lifting. He has learned from the morning's awkward packing and ties it narrow enough for the passage. The next carrier, who had offered confident advice earlier, now watches the bundle pass cleanly and chooses silence. The scribe adds the returned items to his note. Small improvements do not require applause. They require someone to remember them long enough to avoid repeating the same inconvenience tomorrow. The bundle's balance now matches the passage it must cross. Damaged tools go back for repair the same evening. A blunt chisel left in the basket becomes tomorrow's delay. The workday closes in stages rather than at one signal. Wet plaster is protected, pigments are covered, brushes are rinsed or shaped, chisels are counted, lamps are extinguished where light is no longer needed. The scribe reads the tool list against the gathered bundle and finds one item missing. Nobody panics. The carpenter remembers lending it to the right side, and Penub walks back to retrieve it. A royal tomb contains many hidden corners even before it is finished, and a chisel can disappear into any of them with the confidence of an object that does not receive rations. Penub finds it beside the repaired crack, carries it out, and the list closes. The recovered chisel returns to the counted group. The tool list can finally close without an unexplained gap. The day closes in stages because the tasks do. Nothing is signed off until the tool count has no unexplained gap. A closed tool list is the condition for the next morning starting on time. The crew starts down toward the village with tools, empty containers, and the corrected ration note. The worker who challenged his allocation carries the proper grain measure with him. That is the payoff of this second story's supply problem. Tomb work was sustained by organized crafts and by a provision system that could be documented, checked, delayed, disputed, and repaired. The records reveal quarrying, surface preparation, drawing, painting, tool control, and payment because those processes depended on one another. The men are not anonymous labor beneath a monument. They are specialists whose hands, households, and administrative claims shaped the pace of the royal project. The path home is easier with a balanced ration, though the grain remains entirely committed to being heavy. The full measure makes the walk home feel properly earned. The walk back carries empty containers and full records. Both matter for the morning. As the village wall comes into view, the scribe separates the day's notes. The attendance compilation will receive one kind of update. Tool and supply records will go elsewhere. The ration correction must remain with the account it changed. This sorting prevents the documentary abundance from becoming a limestone heap with excellent intentions. Penub returns the repaired basket, the carpenter stores the chisel, and the worker carries grain toward his doorway. The royal valley behind them holds prepared walls and unfinished work. The village ahead holds meals, disputes, letters, bargains, and lessons. Records follow the crew into both places, because work allocation does not mark the boundary of written life. One small legal complaint is already waiting near the gate. The waiting complaint at the gate belongs to another kind of record. Work notes and household notes are separated before either can be mislaid. The complaint at the gate belongs to a different file. Work records and private records were separated by the same hand on the same evening. Years have passed within the same long-lived community. It is now the late 19th dynasty, under the ruler Sipta, and a village scribe sits before a local court of workmen. 3 metal spikes belonging to Pharaoh are missing, and a worker named Hu has been accused of taking them. The surviving limestone ostracon carries 18 lines on one face and 19 on the other, describing his trial and condemnation. 3 spikes are small enough to fit in one hand and large enough to occupy nearly an entire stone. The scribe's ordinary goal is to preserve the proceedings clearly enough that the judgment can stand after the speakers leave. He listens for names, claims, and the order in which the court reaches its decision. The scribe leaves a clear margin for the decision still to come. The same community persisted across generations, which is why its archive covers courts, households, and wages rather than a single year. The trial ostracon is associated with the late 19th dynasty and the reign of Siptah, placing it generations after the year 40 register. The court is local, composed within the necropolis community rather than staged in a distant royal hall. Deir el-Medina's workmen could bring disputes before bodies of colleagues or officials, though jurisdiction and penalties were not identical in every case. The ostracon tells us that Hoy was tried and condemned for stealing the 3 spikes. It does not license a dramatic reconstruction of every witness, gesture, or punishment. The scribe records the matter's structure and keeps imagined dialogue out of the stone. In the plausible scene, an official states what is missing, Hoy is identified, and the court considers the accusation. The practical issue is property entrusted to the royal workforce. Tools and fittings must remain accounted for, because every untracked object weakens the same system that feeds and equips the crew. Neighbors serve as witnesses to both property and procedure. The court was composed from within the necropolis community itself. Neighbors judged neighbors, and neighbors witnessed the judgment. Judgment inside the community meant the people deciding also had to live with the person decided against. The spikes are placed where the court can see them if they have been recovered, or described if they have not. The surviving object record does not settle that visual detail, so the narration does not pretend certainty. What survives securely is the accusation, the royal ownership, the local court, and the judgment against Hoy. The scribe writes in hieratic on limestone, using a medium familiar for legal and administrative notes. Spoken statements become a written sequence through selection. Hesitation, repetition, and tone disappear. Names, actions, and result remain. This movement from oral practice to written record was central to private and official business in the village. Writing did not replace speech. It fixed the parts that the community needed to carry beyond the hearing. Only the supported sequence is allowed onto the stone. The ostracon recording this trial carries 18 lines on one face and 19 on the other. Only the supported sequence reaches the stone. Spoken claims were compressed into durable hieratic notes rather than preserved as transcripts. What survives is the decision, not the argument. Hoy stands before neighbors who know him from work and village life. That closeness may have made local adjudication efficient, uncomfortable, or both, but the ostracon does not reveal his feelings. The scribe avoids inventing them. He keeps his attention on the adult task of accurate recording. One line identifies the property. Another connects it to the accusation. The court's decision follows. Because the surface is limited, the writer must compress without losing the legal spine. Deir el-Medina texts often show this practical compression. A transaction can be reduced to items and values. A letter can preserve requests and complaints. A court note can make a complicated morning look orderly. The order belongs partly to the record, not necessarily to the experience. His brush preserves outcome without claiming access to motive. Hoy was tried for stealing 3 spikes belonging to Pharaoh. The theft is specific, small, and preserved for that reason. The court condemns Hoy. The British Museum description establishes that outcome but does not, by itself, support a detailed account of sentence or enforcement. The scribe therefore finishes the judgment and leaves punishment undescribed. This is an important discipline in an episode about abundant records. Rich evidence can encourage overconfidence. 37 lines are many compared with silence, yet they are not permission to supply whatever remains missing. The court has achieved its practical goal. The accusation has been heard and a decision recorded. The crew can treat the matter as resolved within the terms preserved. Hoy's later life is outside this scene. The scribe dries the ink and prepares the ostracon for storage or transmission, carrying the result without turning it into spectacle. The dry ink carries the judgment farther than any remembered tone. The condemnation survives. The tone of the room does not. Written outcome travels further than remembered speech. 3 spikes belonging to Pharaoh were enough to bring a man before his neighbors. Scale and seriousness are not the same thing. After the court disperses, an adult villager waits with a private account. She has exchanged household goods and wants the terms preserved. Women at el-Medina could own property, conduct transactions, correspond, and appear in disputes. Although the surviving record and scribal mediation vary, the specific bargain here is a composite built from the documented culture of accounts, not a quotation from one object. The woman names the items, the other party confirms them, and the scribe sets down measures or values in a shared accounting system. Coin does not need to change hands for objects to be compared. The record protects memory by making each side visible. It also gives the scribe a second ordinary task after the court. Turn an agreement into a form both households can later recognize. The account begins with objects that both parties can see. Private business filled thousands of these chips. A court sitting in a household account could be written by the same hand on the same afternoon. A folded cloth, a jar, and a small measure of grain sit between the parties. Their values are discussed in units that could compare unlike goods, even when payment occurred through commodities rather than minted money. The exact exchange rates changed with time and circumstance, so the scribe checks the agreement at hand rather than invoking a permanent price list. He repeats each item aloud, receives assent, and writes it. The participants are not passive subjects of bureaucracy. They use writing to steady a transaction they have chosen. One household parts with stored goods. Another receives what it needs. The account marks the balance. The written line has consequence because the people around it agree that the line will matter if memory later becomes selective. Agreement turns comparison into an obligation each side recognizes. Both parties can see the goods, which is the point. Written terms grew out of transactions that also relied on speech, witnesses, and memory. The woman asks for a message to accompany one item to a relative. Several hundred letters on papyrus and ostraca survive from Deir el-Medina, revealing requests, news, complaints, greetings, and household arrangements. Many were written by scribes for senders, while some villagers possessed varying degrees of literacy. The scribe takes a clean sherd and asks whom the message addresses. He does not assume that the sender cannot read or write. The evidence for individual skill is uneven. She dictates the necessary content, he shapes it into a conventional form, and she corrects one practical detail. The resulting letter belongs to both oral and written worlds. Her purpose drives it. His hand gives it durable form. The sender's correction remains part of the message's making. Her purpose remains visible even though the scribe supplies the hand. Women appear in this correspondence as senders and recipients. The hand may be the scribe's while the purpose is not. Correspondence from this community is evidence for social history and for women's letter writing, not only for administration. The message concerns delivery and timing, not a grand event. That ordinariness is precisely what makes the corpus valuable. A household needs an object sent, a relative informed, or a promise confirmed. The scribe writes a greeting, states the request, and checks the recipient's name. Letters could travel by a trusted carrier, rather than through a modern postal institution. The woman selects an adult neighbor, already walking in that direction. The sherd is heavier than papyrus, but less vulnerable to casual folding. The carrier listens to the oral explanation as well, because a written note and spoken context can reinforce one another. Once again, writing does not silence the village, it travels inside conversation. The carrier repeats only what the sender asked him to carry. The message concerns delivery and timing. Most surviving letters are about arrangements rather than sentiment. Timing and delivery are what most letters are for. Grand events are rare in the surviving practical correspondence. A young trainee waits near the doorway with a copied passage, and the adult scribe turns to it only after the transaction closes. Literary ostraca, model letters, word lists, and grammatical exercises from Dear el-Medina have often been connected to education, but scholars caution that not every literary fragment is certainly a student's exercise. The hand before him is less practiced than his own, so this particular scene can plausibly involve instruction. He points to one sign, asks for a correction, and watches it rewritten. The lesson is practical. A scribe must control forms well enough to handle accounts, letters, administrative reports, and texts whose purposes differ. The trainee's correction changes no royal policy. It changes whether one line can be read without guesswork. The trainee studies the space as carefully as the signs. Teaching material sits in the same corpus. Model letters, verb paradigms, and word lists among the practical records. The teaching material includes a copied letter, a verb paradigm, and a list of rare words, with literary pieces numerous in the same selection. The scribe then compares the trainee's model letter with the real household message just completed. Formula and life overlap, but are not identical. A learned greeting provides structure. The sender's actual need supplies content. This is how training becomes useful without becoming mechanical. Dear el-Medina's texts preserve both repeated conventions and individual situations. The trainee copies the address more carefully. The adult returns the lesson shared and reminds him, in ordinary terms, to leave enough room for the ending. The historical evidence does not preserve this advice, so it remains plausible staging. Its consequence is visible on the surface. The next line is less crowded, and the message can finish where the stone allows. The better ending fits because the earlier line was restrained. The copied form now serves the sender instead of merely imitating a model. A copied model becomes useful the moment it is adapted to a real sender. Until then it is only practice. Nearby, a draftsman has left a quick figure on another chip. Sketches from the village include animals, people, deities, working studies, and images whose purpose is uncertain. Some show remarkable freedom beside the formal discipline of tomb walls. The scribe looks without classifying it. Modern categories such as practice, amusement, plan, or finished art may overlap, and provenance can be incomplete. The chip joins letters, court cases, accounts, and lessons as one more kind of mark made within the community. Its presence does not prove that everyone drew, any more than the legal ostracon proves everyone judged cases. It shows that skilled image makers used the same abundant material that administrators and learners used for words. The image remains useful without a forced modern label. A quick sketch on a chip resists modern labeling. It was made by someone whose work was making marks. The corpus includes literature as well as accounts. A copy of the Tale of Sinuhe sits in the same body of material as a ration dispute. The household parties return to the account. One item has been described too broadly, and the owner wants its conditions specified. The scribe adds a phrase rather than starting over. Corrections and additions show that records were made amid negotiation, not delivered from a perfect bureaucratic mind. The other party agrees. The jar's contents, the cloth's quality, or the measure's amount becomes clearer, and the balance holds. The agreement now has a consequence. Goods can move. The woman lifts the item destined for her relative, attaches the message, and hands it to the carrier. The court record settled a public accusation. This smaller document settles a private exchange. Both depend on people accepting that selected words can stand for actions after the meeting ends. The added phrase protects both memory and consent. An added phrase can protect consent as well as memory. The record exists so that neither party has to rely on recollection alone. The carrier leaves with the message, and the scribe sorts the remaining pieces. Hoy's court ostracon must stay with legal records. The transaction belongs with the parties, or the scribe's own archive. Depending on practice, we cannot reconstruct for this exact composite. The trainee keeps the exercise. The sketch returns to its maker. Abundant writing does not mean a centralized library held every scrap in perfect order. Documents circulated, were kept, reused, discarded, broken, and later scattered. Some landed in deposits that preserved them. Others vanished. The scribe's sorting is therefore functional, not prophetic. Each text goes where it can complete its immediate job. History will receive only what survives that journey. Use determines where each piece belongs for now. No central archive waits to rescue a piece put in the wrong hands. There is no central archive standing behind any of this. A piece put in the wrong hands is simply lost. Pieces were held by the people who needed them. Nothing here was deposited anywhere for safekeeping. The adult woman reaches her doorway with the agreed goods and a copy or memory of the terms. Her goal has been met. She needed a transaction made clear and a message sent. The village's writing practices helped accomplish both. The legal case has also moved from accusation to recorded judgment. These outcomes explain why private life appears so vividly in Deir el-Medina's record. A concentrated literate community used writing not only for royal work, but for exchanges, correspondence, teaching, disputes, devotion, and personal affairs. Yet access was unequal, authorship often uncertain, and survival selective. The record is intimate without being democratic in every respect, and detailed without being whole. The woman's completed task closes without requiring a public ceremony. The completed exchange leaves both households able to act on the same terms. Both households can now act on the same terms. That is the whole function of writing the agreement down. Late light crosses the village street. The court stone, transaction account, and lesson sherd all hold different kinds of authority. One carries a communal judgment, one preserves an agreement, one trains a future hand. Their shared material can hide their different purposes if we treat every ostracon as the same kind of scrap. The scribe knows the distinctions because he made them for use. He wraps the legal piece, leaves the account accessible, and returns the pallet to its box. The carrier is already beyond the gate with the household message. A written request is moving toward an answer, while the village court's decision stays behind. Action separates the documents more clearly than any catalogue label. Purpose, not material alone, gives each text its force. The material is cheap and the purpose is not. What gives each text force is what it was for. Ostraka carried letters, transactions, court cases, teaching, literature, sketches, religion, and household records. The material was cheap enough to use for anything. At the recipient's house, the carrier delivers the sherd and repeats the sender's oral explanation. The adult recipient reads what he can or asks another person to read, a choice the evidence leaves open. The requested item and timing are understood. He sets aside what must be returned and sends a verbal acknowledgement with the carrier. The message has completed its small route. Its words mattered because they produced an action, not because they survived for scholars. Back at the scribe's doorway, the account remains ready should either party dispute the exchange. The third story settles with two practical outcomes: a court judgment recorded and a household arrangement carried through. The acknowledgement returns by the same human route. The reply carries enough certainty for the sender's next practical step. The carrier repeats the sender's words and brings back an answer. Oral and written delivery traveled together. The scribe places the dry brush beside the lamp. He has not recorded the whole village day. He has selected what court, household, and learner required. An accusation and judgment, terms of exchange, a message, and a correction. The omissions are as real as the lines. Voices have faded, gestures have vanished, and motives remain partly unknown. Still, the documents changed what people could do next. High's case could be cited as decided. Goods could move under agreed terms. A relative could act on a request. A trainee could improve a hand. The doorway grows quieter, and the stored stones keep only the portions of life that someone once needed to remain clear. The lamp leaves the stored edges visible, then still. The day's selected words rest beside the objects they have already moved. The brush dries beside the lamp. The day's words rest next to the objects they have already moved. Several generations later, the village faces a harder accounting problem. It is year 29 of Ramesses III in the 20th dynasty. Grain rations owed to the royal tomb workers have been delayed. Amunacht, a village scribe, prepares to record what happens as the crew stops work and carries its complaint toward the officials responsible. The Turin strike papyrus identifies him as the writer of the report. This is often called the earliest recorded or earliest documented labor strike. That wording matters. It is the earliest surviving case presently known in such detail, not proof that no workers anywhere had ever stopped before. Amunacht's immediate task is smaller than the label. He must keep names, movements, deliveries, and statements clear while hungry households wait. The first lines are written before the outcome is known. Generations later, the problem is wages rather than attendance. The first lines are written before anyone knows how it ends. The papyrus recording what follows names Amunacht as its writer, which is both unusual and useful. The crew's compensation depended heavily on grain rations. When those provisions failed to arrive, the absence was not an abstract budget delay. Grain was the base from which households made daily food and drink. Workers could not decorate a royal tomb indefinitely on promises. The men leave their assigned work and gather, making the stoppage visible. Amunacht follows with writing materials, not as a distant observer, but as part of the community's administration. He listens to the complaint. The ration is overdue, need has entered the houses, and officials must answer. The surviving papyrus preserves the conflict through an administrative hand. It does not contain every worker's voice, yet it records collective action strongly enough that the day cannot be reduced to a private grievance. The complaint begins in houses where stored grain is already thinning. Compensation depended heavily on monthly grain rations, measured, recorded, and vulnerable to delay. The workers move through the Theban necropolis and sit near a royal memorial temple. The papyrus reports that they spent time at temples associated with earlier kings while seeking delivery of the grain owed to them. These were purposeful places within the administrative and sacred landscape, not theatrical backdrops. By leaving the work site and remaining where officials could not ignore them, the crew changed the terms of the conversation. Amunacht records the movement and the request. He does not need to invent a leader's speech. The document's surviving summary is enough. The workers stopped, gathered, and demanded their rations. Their action joins bodily need to public procedure. The same state that tracked attendance must now answer for a failure in supply. Their seated presence makes delay impossible to hide. In year 29 of Ramesses III, suspended rations brought the workmen out to sit in the Theban necropolis. They gathered at temples in the Theban necropolis, which put the delay somewhere it could not be overlooked. An official tells the workers to return. They remain. The Turin account describes refusals and repeated efforts to bring the grievance before higher authority. The men seek not a symbolic victory, but grain that should already have reached their households. Amunacht notes the response and the continued stoppage. His record makes the sequence legible. Delayed payment, collective withdrawal, gathering, official instruction, refusal, renewed complaint. This is not a single dramatic shout preserved intact. It is a process extending across days, with partial deliveries and renewed action. The scribe's brush follows that process one entry at a time. Each line keeps the crew's reason attached to its movement, so the stoppage cannot be dismissed as unexplained absence. The record follows the refusal without sharpening it into theatre. Ordered back, the men at times refused. The record follows the refusal without dramatizing it. Refusal is recorded plainly. The scribe writes what happened without deciding whether it was justified. Some grain is delivered, easing the immediate pressure without ending the larger problem. The papyrus indicates that authorities paid an amount due, yet the workers later stopped again when difficulties continued. A Munaktad checks what has arrived against what was expected. Measures are counted, households considered, and the crew decides whether the delivery resolves the claim. The record does not turn satisfaction into a simple yes or no. Payment can be partial, late, or followed by another interruption. The scribe writes the receipt and preserves the recurrence. An administrative system that produced detailed accounts could still fail to deliver what its own accounts required. The strength of the record lies partly in showing that paperwork and provision were not the same thing. A partial answer is entered as partial, not complete. Grain was delivered and further stoppages still followed. A partial answer is entered as partial. Authorities delivered grain and the stoppages resumed anyway. One delivery did not repair the underlying schedule. At another gathering, the workers seek a direct path for their complaint. The papyrus reports that they wanted their poor conditions conveyed toward the king, rather than quietly absorbed by lower officials. Amunna records the intention with care. The workers' action is collective and practical, grounded in what is owed. No modern political vocabulary needs to be placed in their mouths. They know the crew's obligations and the state's obligations through the terms of their work. By stopping and remaining together, they insist that the broken exchange be recognized. The scribe sets down their movement as an event in the necropolis administration, giving their refusal the same documentary seriousness once given to attendants and tools. Their request remains tied to provisions already earned. The line remains measured because the need itself is already plain. The complaint seeks a direct route to someone who can act. Measured language is more useful here than heat. Plain wording carried further than anger would have. The need was already obvious to everyone who could read the line. The dispute continues through additional stops and negotiations. The workers gather at another temple, receive instructions, and persist when the promised stability does not last. Later summaries often compress these episodes into one strike, but the papyrus records a sequence of actions and returns. Amunna, therefore, keeps the days distinct. He cannot make a late ration arrive by writing about it, but he can prevent one partial payment from erasing the next failure. The crew's collective memory is supported by the record. Each line says, in effect, that this happened after that, and that the reason remained grain owed for labor. The human chain continues. Workers speak, representatives carry requests, officials answer, measures arrive, and the scribe tests the answer against the account. Sequence protects the crew from having one payment erase another delay. Keeping the sequence straight matters. One payment must not be allowed to erase a separate outstanding delay. The state system had delivery schedules, classes of workers, and recorded amounts, and it had failures. The failures are what generated this document. In the village, households respond to the uncertainty. Grain already stored is measured more carefully. Exchanges that might have waited become urgent. The papyrus does not provide a full portrait of every home, so the scene remains restrained. A monarch sees containers opened and amounts discussed as he returns between meetings. He knows that the crew's complaint comes from these doorways as much as from the worksite. A delayed ration shifts pressure through spouses, children, relatives, and neighbors, even when the official text names only workmen and administrators. He does not attempt to record every household consequence. He writes enough to preserve why the crew stopped and what authorities did next. Household caution gives the public complaint its steady urgency. He records the pressure without claiming to hear every conversation inside. Households felt the delay before the record did. Stored grain thinning at home is what brought anyone to sit in the necropolis. The next delivery is checked in the open. Measures pass from state store to crew representatives, then toward households. A monarch compares the distribution with earlier notes. The action is quieter than the stoppage, but it completes the same story. A protest over missing grain can only resolve when grain becomes present, measured, and accepted. The scribe marks what has been given. Workers watch the level of each measure and the order of names. Their attention is not distrust for its own sake. It is the practical vigilance of people whose previous payment failed. The account and the grain must agree closely enough for the crew to return without surrendering the claim. The accepted measure is the first quiet sign of resolution. The full container and the written amount can finally be compared directly. The delivery is checked in the open, so the container and the written amount can be compared by everyone present. Measuring in the open is not ceremony. It is the only way a written figure and a full container can be reconciled in front of witnesses. The surviving strike papyrus is not devoted solely to the stoppage. It also contains other administrative material, including attendance, grain distribution, memoranda, oaths, and a record involving property given by a man to his former wife. This mixed content shows how documents could accumulate different texts rather than conform to a modern single-subject file. A monarch turns to another section after recording the delivery. The same role carries public conflict and ordinary administration side by side. That does not make the strike casual. It places it within the working life of a scribe who had many matters to preserve. The extraordinary event entered an ordinary documentary practice. The mixed role reflects a working archive rather than a polished chronicle. The role's variety is part of its ordinary working life. The papyrus that preserves the strike also carries attendance, grain, oaths, memoranda, and household matters. It was a working roll, not a monument. The roll mixes strike events with attendance, grain, oaths, memoranda, and household matters, because that is how a working scribe used a papyrus. With the immediate ration distributed, some workers prepare to return. Their decision is not framed as defeat or spectacle. They have made the failure visible, forced response, and secured provisions, though the wider instability has not vanished. A monarch records the return as carefully as the stoppage. A labour action has a beginning, a duration, and a practical end for this phase. Tools are gathered. The path toward the royal valley reopens. Houses receive grain. The crew's action becomes one more reason why attendance cannot be read as a moral score. Workers may be absent because they are ill, caring for family, reassigned, observing ritual, or collectively refusing work when payment fails. Return becomes possible because the immediate obligation has been met. The crew's next movement follows the provision now in hand. With grain in hand, the crew can move again. The provision determines the next step, rather than any decision about principle. A monarch reviews his lines after the crew disperses. The papyrus is damaged and difficult in places, and modern translations remain acts of scholarship rather than transparent windows. The scribe's original report also selected and organized events. We know what he wrote, not everything said around him. That limit does not weaken the core evidence. The text securely places a ration crisis, a work stoppage, gatherings at temples, negotiations, deliveries, and renewed action in the reign of Ramesses III. It is enough to call the episode the earliest documented labour strike presently known. It is not enough to claim the first human strike in all history. Damage and selection remain part of every modern reading. The remaining gaps are named rather than filled with convenient invention. A monarch reviews his own lines afterwards. The gaps are named instead of filled with convenient invention. Naming a gap is a scribal decision as much as filling one. The document is more trustworthy for what it declines to assert. The village street grows less crowded. A worker carries his household's grain inside. Another returns a borrowed container. An official sends a final instruction toward the crew. A monarch copies the necessary detail and checks the date. The conflict settles through these modest acts rather than through a grand closing scene. The ration reaches a doorway. The account records it. The workers know what has been acknowledged. Tomorrow's attendance will have to distinguish return from continued grievance, just as earlier records distinguished illness from reassignment. The documentary habit of Dear el-Medina remains responsive to change because the community's life keeps producing conditions that a simple present or absent mark cannot explain. The corrected account now rests beside the actual containers. A final notation joins delivered grain to the people who received it. A final notation ties delivered grain to the people who received it. That link is the record's real product. Grain received, names recorded, and the two finally joined. That link is what the whole apparatus existed to produce. A monarch rolls the papyrus carefully. Beside the strike report are records of grain, attendance, oaths, death, and household property. The roll is extraordinary to modern readers because it preserves collective labor action so early and so clearly. To the scribe, it is also unfinished work. Later events may require more lines, and some matters will never enter the document at all. He ties the roll and places it with other records. The titles almost everything returns in its proper scale. The workers left an unusually dense archive, but even their most famous papyrus is mixed, selective, damaged, and incomplete. Its value comes from what it can support, not from pretending it says more. The cord closes the roll without pretending the matter is complete. Storage protects the document without turning it into a finished history. The roll is stored rather than completed. It was never intended to become a finished history. The papyrus survived storage rather than curation. Most of this archive reached us because it was cheap, dry, and never formally kept. The last tools are put away for evening. The attendance stone rests near smaller chips. Grain containers stand inside houses. The strike papyrus lies wrapped, holding the order of a conflict that has paused. A monarch cleans the brush and closes the palette. He has recorded enough for the crew's action and the administration's response to remain intelligible. He has not captured every hunger, argument, fear, or relief. The record ends where his task ends. Outside, the path between village and worksite is empty for the moment, and the walls keep the day's remaining warmth. The brush dries beside the palette while the room grows dimmer. The tied records and measured grain now require no further movement. Tools away, records tied, grain measured. Nothing further needs moving tonight. In the quiet that follows, the network of records can be seen without adding to it. One limestone face holds names and absences. Another carries rations. A court case remains on its own stone. Letters and lessons have gone to their proper hands. The papyrus keeps the workers' collective refusal and the grain that answered it. None is a complete diary, yet together they preserve the unusual closeness promised at the start. A monarch leaves the stored bundle untouched. The village settles around records made for immediate use, while the people who made them turn toward food, lamps, doorways, and rest. No new entry is needed to make the day's pattern clear. The final image is not completeness, but careful use followed by quiet storage. What survives is not a complete picture, but a set of careful uses, each followed by quiet storage. The broad limestone rests with its red and black marks dry. Beside it, the brush lies across the closed palette. No name needs another date tonight. The grain measure stands near a doorway, and the last loose kernels have settled at its base. Farther along the wall, a lamp holds a small, steady light. The village path is empty now. Stone, brush, grain, doorway, and lamp remain where familiar hands left them, each object quiet after carrying its part of the day. The air no longer carries reports from the gate, and the broad stone no longer needs to turn in a waiting hand. The doorway holds a narrow rectangle of darkness, and the grain jar remains just inside it. A folded record rests beneath its cord. Smaller limestone chips lie nearby, their uneven edges no longer pressing against a writer's fingers. The repaired basket is set against the wall. A tool handle points toward the darkened doorway, and the grain container keeps its level shape in the lamplight. Nothing is being counted. Nothing is being corrected. The marks already made remain still, and the room around them has grown simple. The repaired handle, the tied bundle, and the quiet jar share the same low band of light near the floor. No hand reaches for them now, and no mark is added to the edges already filled. The lamp sends a narrow light across the stored stones. Red marks soften at the edge of shadow. Black lines hold their places. The brush, rinsed and shaped, no longer moves from name to date or from measure to note. Beyond the doorway, the pale path lies beneath the evening. The work site, the village wall, and the rooms between them are joined only by the memory of footsteps already taken. Nothing crosses the threshold now, and the path keeps the faint shape of footsteps that have already gone. The lamp keeps one familiar corner visible while the rest of the room settles beyond it. One wrapped papyrus rests beside the attendance stone. The cord around it is firm. Grain has reached the house. Tools have reached the wall. The doorway is closed enough to keep out the drifting dust, and the lamp is lowered. Familiar objects remain in their familiar order. Limestone, pallet, basket, measure, cord, and brush. Their surfaces hold the day's use without asking for another line. The familiar cord, grain, stone, and brush stay close. Each returned to the place prepared for it. The brush rests beside the pallet, parallel to the cord around the folded record. The last lamp grows smaller beside the wall. Its light touches the edge of limestone, the curve of a grain jar, the tied record, and the brush laid down. Outside, the path is still. Inside, the stored marks remain incomplete and sufficient, close together in the quiet room. The doorway darkens. The lamp settles. The records stay where careful hands have placed them, and the village evening holds them without another word. The small flame leaves the stored surfaces one by one, until only their settled shapes remain together. Stone, grain, cord, and brush remain together after the flame has nearly withdrawn.